Did you know that most podcasts don't make it past 10 episodes? So the fact that this show has made it to episode 57 and counting, and that we've recently passed our 1 year anniversary, is definitely a reason to celebrate. So I'll be reflecting on the past 12 months, my first year in podcasting, and we'll explore everything from how and why I started the podcast, its launch, initial reception, right through to our plans and aspirations for the future in this special episode of Architecture Business Club, a weekly podcast for solo and small firm architecture practice owners just like you who want to build a profitable, future-proof architecture business that fits around their life. I'm John Clayton, your host. If you're a small practice leader or sole practitioner in architecture, struggling to find clarity or reach your goals, consider working with me. I offer personalised one-to-one support through coaching, consulting and mentoring. This tailored approach helps you navigate your unique path to success. Whether it's growing your practice, working fewer hours or building your team, I've got you covered. Just click the link in the show notes to book a call with me to discuss your options or email John, that's Jon, at architecturebusinessclub.com for more information. Now let's celebrate 1 year of Architecture Business Club. Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today. I am super excited about this episode. Today, I wanted to celebrate this podcast's 1 year anniversary. Yes, it's a huge milestone, and there are not many podcasts that get this far. So I'm really, really proud at what we've achieved so far. So I wanted to give you some numbers just to kind of put this into context. So I've had a look at some data about podcasts generally, and according to podcastindex.org, as of June 2024, they reckon that there are just short of 4.2 million total podcasts registered around the world. According to some other sources, there is a bit of variation on that. I think I've seen some websites quote it as low as 3 million, others saying it's as high as 6 million, but we're going to go for this one. So we're going to say it's around about 4.2 million. And according to Pod News, 44% of all podcasts have less than 3 episodes. It's quite surprising, isn't it? In fact, most podcasts don't make it past 10 episodes. Since launching this podcast in November 2023, we've released at least 1 episode every single week since our official launch date on the 16th of November in 2023. So during that time, we've recorded 42 guest interviews and I've recorded 15 solo episodes. So to date, we've got 57 episodes in total, plus 3 bonus podcast episodes and a podcast trailer. Throughout that time, the show has attracted listeners from 100 countries around the world. I mean, how amazing is that? 100 countries. I kind of can't believe these statistics when I look at them. We are most popular in the UK. So I think audience numbers are around 55%-ish are based in somewhere in the UK. And our next most popular country is the USA. So we have a big proportion of listeners from the USA. And then in third place, we've got our friends down under in Australia. And then many, many other countries that people listen from. As I say, that we have attracted listeners from 100 countries now, which is quite amazing. Admittedly, when I look at the numbers, some of the countries at the lower end of that list, there's maybe only like 1 or 2 listeners there. But it's pretty incredible, isn't it? That like somebody can create any piece of content, like a podcast, a video, a blog, and it can be consumed by people all over the world. And it's still quite a staggering feat when I think about that. And in terms of kind of downloads, we are just a few downloads short of our first 10,000 downloads, which in just roughly around 12 months of podcasting, this is actually a pretty incredible achievement. This 10,000 might not sound a lot when you compare it to, say, something like TikTok views, that sort of thing. But in the world of podcasting, this is really, really good. So I'm incredibly proud of this achievement so far. And I firmly believe that this is just the beginning for the show, really. So why did I launch the podcast in the first place? Well, I have talked about this a little bit in previous episodes, but in truth, I found being a sole practitioner in architecture really challenging, particularly the social isolation and the weight of everything, the weight of every decision in the business resting on just my shoulders, and really just that feeling of not knowing if I was doing the right thing or not for my business and my livelihood. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, and in hindsight, I now realise that a lot of those mistakes would have been easily preventable had I had some even basic knowledge about running a business and of sales and marketing. And I guess I kind of figured that if these were things that I'd been struggling with, if I'd struggled with running a business and with sales and marketing, that other people in the industry probably struggled with that too. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool to do something to help other people like me, to kind of pay it forward, so to speak? Prior to launching the podcast, I actually spent a number of years filling my own knowledge gaps through reading business books, listening to podcasts, and attending sales and marketing conferences and workshops. I really became a bit of a nerd, I suppose. I started to get really interested and exciting about business and sales and marketing. And that really became the main focus for me in the last few years. And I got to a point in my life when I think I'd finally found a way to work around my own self-doubt and insecurities and my imposter syndrome, and to essentially become a content creator. I felt that podcasting was likely to be the medium that I felt most comfortable with, and it seemed like it would probably be most enjoyable to me. I had played around with creating some video content previously, and I managed to do it. It was okay. I wouldn't say I was particularly comfortable. I'm not sure if many people are naturally comfortable being on camera, but I'd always liked the idea of podcasting and thought, well, that would be kind of cool, wouldn't it, to be a podcaster? I thought that would be quite a cool thing to do. And I guess I just didn't want that added pressure and the added work of producing videos, certainly at the outset of doing something new. I thought, you know what, this is going to be such a challenge anyway, like this idea of creating some kind of useful content for other business owners in architecture, that in itself was going to be such a big challenge for me to try and get started and to achieve that in the first place. Did I really want to overcomplicate it by adding video into that mix at the same time? So that was a conscious decision, despite many of the marketers that I'd been listening to at many workshops and conferences talking about, oh, it's all about video and it has to be a video approach and all of that. Ironically, we do actually record videos when we record these podcasts. Primarily it is audio, but I do record videos as part of this, the promotion of the podcast. That's something that we might touch upon a little bit more later in this episode. But going back to the kind of reasons behind this launch. So also having listened to other podcasts in the architectural sphere, I couldn't really find another podcast that really spoke to me. Like, I think particularly coming from a place of being in the profession as an architectural technologist rather than an architect, I just really couldn't find anything that felt like it was like my podcast. It was my people, my tribe. And I really felt like there was space for something new, something fresh when it came to podcasts talking about the business side of architecture. Having looked for a podcast that focused on the business side of running a small practice, I did discover a few other shows, and some of those shows are quite well known. Other shows not known quite as well, but in most instances, the shows that I found had episodes that were just too long, like rambling interviews. And I'm not saying that these weren't necessarily interesting or valuable, but just the fact that some of those interviews were like an hour and a half long, that straight away, as a relatively time-poor business owner, it would put me off from ever listening to them. And also a lot of the episode titles and descriptions were so vague. I found it really difficult to decide what was worth my precious time. Like which episode would I even bother listening to, because the titles were so vague. Also, some of the podcasts that I did listen to, some of them I found to be quite negative. Really kind of negative spin on things about the state of the industry, and very much kind of woe is me, and, just really on a downer, and quite honestly quite depressing to listen to. So I felt that something that had a more positive outlook would be beneficial for people. The other thing that I found, that most, if not pretty much all of these shows were made by architects, pretty much exclusively just for other architects. And I have nothing against architects. I work with amazing architects, and I'm friends with architects. Architects are awesome, and they are part of this podcast community too. But I really wanted a show that was more inclusive, I guess, that it was a podcast that would showcase and feature architects, but also other architecture industry professionals, people like architectural technologists like I was, or interior designers, planning consultants, building surveyors, all those other people, those in some ways unsung heroes of the architecture industry that perhaps many people, just certainly the general public, are not as aware of. I also really wish that there was a podcast out there that covered specific topics and answered specific questions in episodes that were short enough for people to listen to on the commute to the office, or during your lunch break, or, when you're taking a dog walk or a walk in the park, something like that. And I also think, importantly, looking beyond the architecture industry for insights and answers. I mean, after all, if this is primarily to be a podcast about the business side of architecture and not architecture itself, doesn't it make sense that actually a lot of the guests that we talk to are from outside of architecture, so that we get a fresh perspective on things, that we're getting perspective from business experts, people that are experts in business and sales and marketing, and we're not just getting those insights from, yes, architects in practice and architecture practice owners that are being successful or have had a challenge that they've overcome, but we're actually getting the latest tips and tactics from people at the cutting edge of business and marketing. And it really felt like there was a place for that, to be able to showcase talent from outside the industry and to expose people within architecture to that knowledge that I'd had an opportunity to access at conferences and events that weren't aimed specifically at people in architecture. So when it came to actually launching the podcast, I mean, how did I actually launch this? I'd previously attended a couple of marketing conferences that featured short sessions about podcasting. So I had taken quite a lot of notes during those conferences, and I did go back and read through those notes, which were really helpful. I also found a free podcasting workshop, which was in a training vol of an online membership community that I was part of, which was mainly a business community, so for small business owners, but they did have a training on podcasting, which was really useful, gave me a really good grounding and understanding about it. I then discovered a free podcasting course over at Captivate.fm, which is the podcast hosting platform that I use for this show. They have got an absolutely fantastic free course on podcasting. You don't even need to provide an email address. You can access that course on their website absolutely for free. I thoroughly recommend you go and check that out if you've got any inclination to start a podcast. I set time aside, a significant amount of time, I would add, to work through that entire course. And it did take a long time. This was not something that you could just work through in a couple of hours and the following day launch your podcast. It took quite a while. There was an avalanche of decisions to make about the show, and there was an awful lot of preparation to do and a few tech hurdles with the software side of things and the equipment to get everything ready to launch the podcast. I also set a target launch date. Now, I'll be honest, I had some reservations about this. The idea of setting a date, a line in the sand, did make me feel a little bit uncomfortable. But that actually was a really important step in making sure that the podcast actually did get launched. I also did a couple of practice interviews with some willing victims. Actually, these were some business buddies that were willing to let me do a dummy interview with them to kind of test all of the software, all of the tech, make sure that the microphone was working right and the video recording technology that we used, the software that we used to record the interviews remotely, all of that worked. And it was a really useful exercise to do because there were quite a few tech hiccups along the way. That was just one of a number of pre-launch fears that I had. I had a number of fears about launching this podcast. One of those was around the tech, so the fear of the technology going wrong. I also had a fear of being noticed. I mean, I've never been somebody that's been comfortable in the limelight. The idea of being in the spotlight in some way through launching and hosting a podcast made me feel quite uncomfortable, if I'm honest. Bizarrely, there was also an equal fear of not being noticed. What if nobody listens? What if I went to all this trouble to launch the show and nobody tuned in? I also had a fear about being judged. So what if people did tune in and listen, but what if they didn't like it? What if people had really negative feedback for me? What if I had made myself look foolish in front of my peers? What then? And just generally, I had quite significant imposter syndrome about the whole thing. Kind of, who am I to think I can do this, to launch this podcast? Preparation definitely helped with some of those fears, because actually going through that process of doing proper planning and preparation to launch the show, working through the course that I've mentioned, really helped build my confidence. The more time that was spent on the preparation, the more confident I felt about launching things. And that really was quite a big help in getting this off the ground. We did oversail the launch date by a couple of weeks. I was hoping originally that the show was going to go live, I think it was around the 1st or 2nd of November. And the show finally launched on the 16th of November 2023. Prior to that, what was it like recording those first few episodes? I mean, I'll be honest, it was still pretty nerve-wracking. I think having done the practice interviews definitely helped. And the way that we launched the show, we actually, when it came to the launch day, we launched with three full episodes that went live on the launch day. So by the time we actually got to the 16th of November, I'd already done a couple of practice interviews and recorded, edited and scheduled 3 full podcast episodes to go out live. So actually by the time the podcast actually launched publicly, I already felt quite well practiced. And this is coming from a place from somebody that I'd never been on a podcast as a guest. I'd never interviewed anybody before, except for a while ago when I was looking at hiring a staff member. I'd done some interviews to hire staff, but I'd never done anything like this, where somebody was coming along as a guest and they were putting their faith in me to present them in a good light and to kind of hold this interview together so that we didn't both look like a pair of idiots. So it did feel like there was that weight of responsibility, but definitely having done the practice interviews and batching it so that we had 3 episodes to go out on the launch day did make me feel more comfortable. On the launch day itself, I mean, by that point, a few months had gone by from me initially deciding that I was going to launch a podcast to actually launching the show. It felt like it had been a long time coming. So, I mean, in some ways, it had been coming for several years. I mean, never mind several months. I mean, I think this is something that I'd had a desire to do something like this for a long time. And I'd faced a few challenges and things in my personal life that had maybe stopped me from doing it before and made me feel like I wasn't able to do this. So, like anything, like it might have seemed maybe to a listener of like, wow, like this sounds really great. You know, maybe John's been doing this a while or he really knows what he's doing. But I mean, in most cases, there's no such thing as an overnight success. I mean, there's usually been many years of work that have gone in beforehand that led that person to a point in their life when they were finally being noticed for what they were doing. I mean, you hear these stories of, you know, people like Ed Sheeran kind of busking away for years before actually kind of making it as a credible artist in music. So, I mean, that launch day, it was both exciting and scary at the same time. There was a real kind of mixture of feelings that day. But it didn't take long for messages to start coming in from both listeners and from those first few guests that had appeared on the show, basically just praising the show, like talking about the quality of it. I remember having a conversation with one business buddy who actually is a partner at an architecture practice, and he said, John, don't take this the wrong way, but I couldn't believe how good the production quality of the show was. And he was sort of like, look, I'm not saying I was expecting it was going to be rubbish because I thought that you'd do a good job, but I was absolutely blown away by the production quality of the show. And even the guests were really quick to praise their whole experience of being a guest on the podcast. And I mean, I got nothing to benchmark this against. Like, I'd never even been a guest on a podcast, so I really didn't know what the process was like. But they said that, wow, you know, like it was so smooth. The onboarding process, the preparation before the interview, the recording itself, the production afterwards. You'd think that you'd been hosting and producing the podcast for years. I mean, I guess that was my lifelong perfectionism coming through. That, I'll be honest, I've been trying to shake that perfectionism off for many, many years, but maybe it's not always a bad trait. So maybe sometimes it's not too bad to be a perfectionist. Remember, don't forget to download the Architecture Business Blueprint, the step-by-step formula to freedom for architects, architectural technologists and architectural designers. You can grab the blueprint without any charge at architecturebusinessclub.com/blueprint. And if you're enjoying this episode, then please leave a 5-star review or rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show. After the launch day, I mean, I continued to receive friendly messages. Like, there wasn't really anything negative. Like, I mean, I guess I'm not saying there weren't people out there that listened and thought, this isn't for me, but the people that bothered to get in touch, they all absolutely loved it. You know, they'd be just saying, thanks for making the show. And that conversation with that guest, like really resonated with me. And it made me feel like I'm not in this on my own, that there's other people that are going through those same challenges. So that was just amazing, really. I really didn't expect to have that kind of response. I subsequently started getting a lot more invitations to things. I was invited to take part in live stream events, live stream interviews. That's something that I hadn't done before. I was invited to be a guest on a number of other podcasts. So that was quite a cool experience to actually get the opportunity to be a guest on other people's shows. And Also to be a guest on video interview shows as well. So I've been interviewed on a few shows that have YouTube channels. So that's been pretty cool. I mean, a byproduct of having something like a podcast is that I've created a never-ending supply of content marketing assets for my business. I mean, honestly, it's literally the tip of the iceberg. The content repurposing that I currently do from one episode each week is, I'll be honest, like pretty minimal. There is so much more. There's an absolute gold mine of like content marketing assets that I can pull out from these episodes that even if the podcast stopped next week, which don't worry, it's not going to stop next week. But if it did stop next week, I would have probably enough content material for like, the next year and beyond, just from kind of pulling out snippets and bits and pieces from the interviews that we've already done. There's also a vault of really valuable resources for anybody else that's in practice, that these episodes are intended that they might not be relevant for you right now, but maybe in a year's time, there might be an episode that you really need to listen to. Maybe it's an episode on sales. Maybe it's something on mindset. Whatever the heck it is, that we're intending that they were building out this vault, this big resource library that is really well indexed with sensible, like Ron Seal style episode titles, so that if you're struggling with something in particular, that you can go and find the relevant podcast episode, and it isn't just going to say interview with John Smith. It is going to tell you what is contained in that episode. I've had the opportunity to have amazing conversations. I mean, some of the guests have been like literally absolutely incredible people. I mean, pretty much all the guests have been incredible. And I've had the opportunity personally to interview some people in business that like I'd really looked up to, like, still do look up to. I mean, I think in particular, Janet Murray. She was probably the first podcaster that I ever listened to. And I've been to a lot of Janet's events. I've seen her talk in person at conferences and events and invested in various business programs and things that she's run. And to have somebody like her on the show and to be able to interview her within the first year of this show just kind of blows my mind. And then having like Chris Ducker on the show. I mean, Chris Ducker, he's like, he's a business legend. He's written all sorts of books. He's such an expert in so many fields, particularly personal branding and hiring virtual staff. Just such a great guy. And again, to get him on the show, like what an amazing honor to have guests of this caliber. And actually all those other conversations, just the conversations with other people in the industry too. Maybe some of those people aren't names that you had heard of before, but all really memorable conversations, and actually you're having the opportunity to help some people make their own debut as a podcast guest. There's a number of the guests that have come on the show that have never been on a podcast before. So I've had the opportunity to help them overcome their nerves and their jitters and to overcome their own fears and to make their podcasting debut on this very show. Like, how amazing is that to get the opportunity to do that? And I'm sure really memorable for them, hopefully in a good way, because I know that it can be quite nerve-wracking. The other thing that's happened like after the launch is that just last month, I was a finalist. I was nominated for the coveted title of Architectural Technologist of the Year in CIAT's annual AT Awards. And that was on the basis of, in recognition of all of my work on this show and my contribution to the industry. Now, I'm just going to rewind to before this show launched. I never would have dreamed, I never, ever in a month of Sundays would ever have dreamed of being at that awards and being a finalist. I have been to the awards once before just as an attendee, but to be there as a finalist and in the main awards, that's the the award that's like the one that, at the end of the awards ceremony, the big award of the night. I mean, okay, I didn't win it, but it doesn't matter. The point is that that's something that I never would have even dreamed possible. And that's happened off the back of launching this show. And the other big thing that happened quite recently, just a week ago, actually, from like the 20th of November, just around a week or so before this episode is going out live, I overcame my own fear of public speaking, and I made my public speaking debut at the UK's leading and largest construction industry expo at London Build 2024. And for somebody that is very much an introvert, and despite what you might think from hearing me on the podcast every week, the idea of standing in front of a room full of people to talk to them about anything filled me with dread. I'm really proud that I was able to overcome that fear. And again, had I not launched the podcast, I never ever would have dreamed of applying to be a speaker at that event. And if I had applied to be a speaker at that event, I'm not so sure if I would have been chosen and got a spot there had I not had the credibility that came from being a podcast host. So what is life like now as a podcaster? I mean, I love podcasting. Like, I absolutely love it. It's changed my life in ways that I could not possibly have imagined just in a relatively short space of time. The downside is it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work to be a podcaster. I would say that at the moment, it takes roughly half a day to write, record and produce one solo episode of the show. And probably on average, it would take roughly a full day to produce a single 30 to 40 minute guest interview episode. That includes connecting with the guest, chatting with them before the interview to discuss topic ideas, some time to think about some interview questions, writing some interview questions, the recording itself, the editing of the episode, writing show notes, social media captions, writing an email newsletter to share with my email list on the day that the episode goes out, creating a few promo graphics and video clips from the recording, scheduling the episode and scheduling the email newsletter and the social media posts for publication. So there are quite a lot of small tasks associated with producing, publishing and promoting a podcast episode. I don't think people realise quite how much work is involved. But I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, I do love podcasting. I would perhaps look to outsource at least some of the production in due course. But to date, everything has been done by me. So this has been a heck of a project over the last year. I won't lie, this has been very consuming over the last 12 months. So looking towards the future, I mean, we've had some amazing guests on the show already. I mean, what guests would I like to appear on the show in the future? Well, from a business perspective, I'm a big fan of Chris Do. I have had the opportunity to meet Chris in person on a couple of occasions, and I have actually spoke to him and asked him about guesting on the show. And Chris, he asked me to come back to him later, basically like once the show was more established and we've hit a certain level of downloads. I did push him a little bit on that, and I won't lie, we've got quite a long way to go in terms of where we need to get to get Chris to come on the show. But you know what? I took his response as a yes. It's just a yes, but a not yet. So we're working towards that. And who knows, someday in the future, Chris may be a guest on the show. Somebody else that I'm a huge fan of, which I haven't invited yet, but I will do in due course, is Marcus Sheridan, the author of They Ask You Answer. It's often referred to as a content marketing Bible. And I've recommended this to a number of my own clients and friends and business buddies because I think it's a fantastic resource that people should go and check out. So that'd be great to have Marcus on the show. From an architecture standpoint, I would love to chat with Eric Reinhold on the show from 30 by 40 Design Workshop. You might know Eric from his hugely successful YouTube channel. I think he's like the top architect YouTuber out there in terms of numbers. I'd also like to interview the founders from Resi, based in the UK. Resi have taken a very different approach to most other architecture firms, really, and I think that is definitely worthy of a conversation. I think generally I would also like to feature more architecture professionals on the show. So if you're an architect, architectural technologist, designer, surveyor, contractor, basically anybody that's working in and around the world of architecture and have a unique point of view on something or an interesting story that you'd like to share, I would love to hear from you. Just email John, that's Jon, at architecturebusinessclub.com, or message me on LinkedIn, and you can find a link to my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. So, okay, what about if you're thinking about launching your own podcast? So I wanted to just share a few tips based on my own experiences over the last 12 months or so. If you're thinking about launching your own podcast, I would say firstly, allow enough preparation time. I would also say that if you do get stuck, help is always close to hand. It's probably closer to hand than you realise. And particularly for anybody that is in the architecture industry or the built environment in construction, feel free to message me. I would be very happy to help you to launch your podcast. So feel free to reach out and drop me a message. I would say do set a launch date and stick to it as much as possible. Don't worry if it slides by a week or two. That's okay. Don't beat yourself up about it, but do set a launch date. It is very, very important. Otherwise, you'll keep pushing it back. Something else will always get in the way and you will never get your podcast launched. I would also say, don't underestimate how much work is involved. I would be really brutally honest on this. You might like the idea of launching a podcast, but it is a lot of work. Do you have the time to self-produce a podcast? And if you don't have the time to do it all yourself, do you have the resources or the funding to get somebody else to help produce it for you? This is particularly important if you have aspirations to launch a regular podcast that's going to be recurring on a weekly, fortnightly, or monthly basis. That level of consistency takes a level of dedication that you might not be prepared for. So do recognize what you might be letting yourself in for before you decide on your publishing frequency. And I would say, just as a final point, whilst ideally, particularly when you're launching your podcast, that you'd ideally be publishing something on a fairly regular basis, weekly, ideally, I would say, there are other options for you. You can release a series. That's quite popular. People release a podcast series, a set number of episodes, and maybe they might release a new series once a quarter or once every 6 months or once a year. You get to decide. It's up to you. The other thing that you could do is create a podcast capsule or capsule podcast show. And essentially it's like a mini series. So it's like a limited series that you just release, like that one series, and it's got some real high quality cornerstone content for your business in that podcast. And it becomes an asset, a marketing asset for your business that you've got forever. This is like long form content that people could still be tuning in years after it's been produced, which you could be sharing with your customers as part of your sales process or part of your marketing funnel. If you're interested in doing anything like that, please reach out to me, because I would love to help some other people get started in podcasting, whether that is on a regular basis or whether that is a capsule or series-based show. So back to the Architecture Business Club podcast. How do I see this podcast developing over time? Growing a podcast can be really hard, and whilst I think it's fair to say we've seen steady growth so far over the first year, which I would expect to see continue. It can be quite hard to grow the show, but I think that is what I anticipate, that we'll continue to see some slow and steady growth in terms of audience numbers. And for now, there's going to be no changes to the frequency of the show. It is going to stay as a weekly show for the foreseeable future. I can't say that that will stay that way forever, but certainly for the moment, that is the way that it is going to stay. I have been toying with publishing a video version of the podcast for some time now, and that is something that I'd like to introduce in the near future. We do have all of the video recordings of every single interview that has taken place on this show, and part of me does feel like it is a crying shame that those are not outside in the public realm, because I know that there are people out there that don't listen to podcasts, that prefer to digest their content over on YouTube. We prefer to watch videos, and that's absolutely okay. It's just that, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't at the beginning, at the outset, want to give myself even more things to have to think about and to have to do, and to add on even more pressure for something that already felt like a huge personal challenge to get an audio version of the show launched. Thinking beyond the podcast, I have always envisaged Architecture Business Club to be more than just a podcast. And I did talk about this back in episode 21. I've always seen the podcast acting as a gateway to a community of like-minded business owners within architecture. And in fact, we recently launched a 3-month trial run of a membership community with 6 founding members. We won't be opening the doors to any new members until after that fixed time period ends, which is going to be roughly around the end of January in 2025. But in the meantime, we have been meeting once a week on Zoom. We've had an hourly meeting together, and in between, we have stayed connected the rest of the week via a messaging app. And so far, we've run business planning sessions, we've had one-to-one networking sessions in breakout rooms, we've had group discussions, the first one of which we had on sales, which was really interesting. We've also done a review and audit of the group members' websites, so giving them feedback on their practice websites, which I think was really valuable for the members. And we've even had our first in-person meetup at London Build. Some of the group members attended the London Build conference, and myself and those group members, we went for an evening out at a nearby pub, and it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's one thing connecting with people online, but to actually get the opportunity to spend time with people in person was just absolutely brilliant. And so far, that whole experience for both me and the founding members has been absolutely amazing. In fact, the exact words that one of the founding members used when we were out at the pub that evening was that this was life-changing. I mean, how incredible is that? I mean, with feedback like that, surely this needs to continue beyond that initial 3-month trial run. And I do feel that this is something that many other people would benefit from, particularly people who are sole practitioners that are perhaps feeling a little bit more isolated than those people that are working in bigger practices. So early next year, so around late January, early February 2025, I do intend to open the doors to that membership community to a limited number of new members. The format moving forward will be similar. We might make a few tweaks pending feedback from the trial run, but essentially it will be a mixture of online group events, a shared resources library, and the occasional in-person meetup, which I hope that we'll be able to do different places around the UK throughout the course of the year. This is something that I wish had existed for me as a sole practitioner in architecture. It didn't exist for me, but now it does exist for you. So if you want to bag one of those limited slots to join this membership community in early 2025, be sure to sign up to our waitlist, and I'll make sure there's a link in the show notes. So thank you so much for hanging in there. This was a longer solo episode than usual. Thank you for indulging me and supporting me throughout. Well, thanks for indulging me with this longer solo episode today, but also thank you to anybody that's been tuning in, that you've listened to episodes throughout the last 12 months, whether that's been ad hoc or you've been tuning in every week. To anybody that has sent me a friendly message after listening to the show or thanking me for producing anything, for anybody that has talked about the show on social media, for anybody that supported the show in any way, I am eternally grateful. It really means the world to me. I do not take you for granted. I want you to know that. And that's everything I wanted to say. So long may it continue. And I look forward to celebrating the 2-year anniversary this time next year. Okay, catch you next time. Next time, I'm joined by Laura Pearman to explore how you can adapt your personal brand as your business changes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Architecture Business Club. If you liked this episode, think other people might enjoy it, or just want to show your support for the show, then please leave a glowing 5-star review or rating wherever you listen to podcasts. It would mean so much to me and makes it easier for new listeners to discover the show. And if you haven't already done so, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss another episode. If you want to connect with me, you can do that on most social media platforms. Just search for @Mr. John Clayton. The best place to connect with me online, though, is on LinkedIn. You can find a link to my profile in the show notes. Remember, running your architecture business doesn't have to be hard, and you don't need to do it alone. This is Architecture Business Club.